Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers from across the literary spectrum about their work and how they do what they do. The Open Mic is about and for writers and the experience of writing and publishing in the modern age. For those of you who don't know, this show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms. And you can subscribe to either or both, which of course would be my preference, so you never miss anything. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on because I am going to pitch you to subscribe one more time. But I want to get right into it with our guest today because he's a really special visitor in that I've only had one other political author on this show, and that was all the way back when we were only doing this as a blog. So that's been quite a few years. The reasons for that are many, most notably that this show is dedicated, with very few exceptions, to having on fiction writers and specifically crime fiction or mystery or thriller authors. I'm making an exception today because my guest has done something almost nobody in his field ever does. He has written a book about politics that is actually interesting. Bill's book is titled It's Better to Win, not It's. No It's there. Better to Win, Hardball Lessons in Leadership, Influence, and the Craft of Politics. And as you might guess from the title, Bill Wong has been around California politics for a very long time. He's an award-winning political consultant, been around for over 30 years, working for lawmakers, candidates, political action committees, labor organizations, nonprofits, other large-scale employers. My Republican friends out there, if you are hearing this and going, oh, I don't want to listen to this guy with the Dems, sit tight. There is something here for you too. There's something here for everybody. I'm sure Bill would agree. Bill, welcome to the Open Mic. Really thrilled to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Rich.
Absolutely, and I am thrilled to have you on because I wasn't kidding. This is a political, but most political books, and you know, if you follow the show, you know I'm a political reporter by trade and editor by trade. I've been doing this for a very long time, 25 years or so. And let's be honest, most books with a political slant in this day and age tend to be toward the polemic end of the scale, sometimes worse, sometimes they're just screeds. They're not really written for anything other than, as we used to say, preaching to the converted already. And as often as not, I think they're written so that one of the two major parties will buy 10,000 copies, hand them out for free, and turn it into a bestseller without anyone actually really ever reading the damn thing, right? A lot of that manipulation. And so I wanted to emphasize why I wanted to have you on the show, because this book's actually really interesting. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. And of course, I am a political person, but what I really liked is that this book is part memoir of your time in politics, but it's also part instruction manual. And you're really blunt in this, which I love. I really like people that are direct. I like that it's aimed at not just, hey, this is me. You're talking about politics and the game and some rules and standards you learned along the way. So I've talked long enough. Please, Bill, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and to present the information in this way.
Thanks. It's a great question. I think the first thing that happened was that I feel like a political inflection point where everything is about just screaming from one perspective or another, and there's really nothing getting solved. And there are many things that need to be solved, and we stopped talking about how to solve those problems. And I was lucky in my career to having been part of efforts that did actually solve problems. And I wanted to at least give the perspective that some things can be fixed if you work together, sometimes work across the aisle, what have you, but it takes some work. It doesn't, me writing a book about how screwed up things are is not going to fix things, but me writing a book about how things got fixed may inspire people to actually go out and fix things. And then the second part of that is I retired after 30 years. So if I wrote something inappropriate, it would not affect my career and I would not get fired. So that allowed me the freedom to be somewhat blunt about my perspective on politics and some of the failings that we have in the industry.
Well, and you talk a lot about leadership. And so tell me a little bit about that. Tell me a bit about, why you focus so much on leadership here.
It's kind of very strange because when I first got into politics, it was about leadership. It was you talked about not elected officials who weren't perfect, but they did show interesting leadership at times of crisis and was able to meet crises in the moment for the people of California, whether you're Republican or Democrat. People made some courageous decisions in a lot of situations where that's what really fascinated me about politics is the story about character, the story about people's personal journey to get to a point where they rose above their own personal interests to do the greater good. And that's how I was brought up in politics. And when I left politics, I was very disenchanted because it just ended up being a lot of show ponies, people emoting all of the right words and the same type of polemics that you talk about, or hyperbole, and it just became so saccharine that I really wanted to put down or a perspective about why aren't we asking about character or values or leadership as part of the political conversation.
Right. Well, and you also talk a lot about character, and you really offer some great examples. But let me start out by saying, how do you define character, and what role does that play in politics? And I hope that's not too obvious of a question, but um, again, you offer some really good examples of how people show character and the circumstances where that really does matter and comes to the forefront. So if you would, tell me a little bit about that, focus on that in the book.
Well, first of all, politics is about our civic life and how we function in society. So I think naturally character should be the foundation of it. Somewhere along the line that came off the rails, and that's no longer what we really talk about because when you're an elected official, when you're working in public service as a staff person, you have to make some really difficult decisions, particularly in the areas that we had huge budget cuts. You had to decide winners and losers, and it's not an easy decision and it's not simple. And you have to live with the consequences of the decision you made. So, character, I believe, is vital in this industry or this career that you choose because you have to make tough choices and you have to speak truth to power so that democracy works. And but we don't really talk about that as a qualifying characteristic before you get into the job. We have people that have a certain external look, but has their character ever really been tested? And I think it really kind of comes from an era where we used to, and I haven't seen it lately, and I don't even know if it still exists. There used to be the Profile and Courage Award that the John F. Kennedy Institute or Library always gave out every year, and I don't remember the last time I saw them awarding somebody with that, at least not in the last 10 years or so. So I think that, recognizing courage and the character to make tough decisions and look out for the greater good are principal in our recovery from where we are today in the world of politics. And when it comes to defining characters, is what you do when people aren't watching. It's how you carry yourself and how you do the right thing when you do it just because it's the right thing, not because it's going to get you media coverage or Twitter followers or any of those types of superficial vanity metrics that we currently aspire to, or at least elected officials currently aspire to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was going to ask you about that because, I've certainly seen it over my time covering politics. And, for a while I covered state houses around the country. And it's a disease that has infected, it feels like lawmakers all everywhere, both parties, the periphery of the parties. And we even saw it with the previous president, who often talked in terms of ratings as opposed to, the gist or the content of policy or of a speech or whatever. It was something about ratings, and which I guess is maybe what we deserve when you elect a game show host as a um, public figure in any way, a public policy figure. But he's not the only one. It's really easy to dump on Trump for being, what he is. But we knew what he was when we elected him, right? Or when he was elected. Okay, that's a bone to my very, very liberal friends. If if that has become the metric by which we are these guys are gauging each other in particular, how do we break that? I mean, you did talk so much about character and being frustrated with how that is. How in the world do we need Twitter to literally collapse? Is that going to be the thing that actually maybe moves us a little bit away from this watching the likes and the retweets as a gauge of whether or not somebody's policy position is worthwhile?
I almost feel that way. It seems so baked into everything that we do. It almost seems like you would need some type of collapse or tectonic change in order to get people to stop and think. I think, for example, COVID sort of did that in a lot of ways. I realized I didn't have to be at an airport for like 4 hours doing nothing, and I could just get things done. I couldn't even realize how much time I wasted in airport until after COVID. I realized I didn't have to do it anymore. I had like so much free time that was out there. But unless something really changes in your day to day, you're not going to notice.
Right, absolutely. I only got the book on Kindle, so I hope people can see this without too much glare. I'm going to hold it like this. So they see it when they see it in the store, but I'll put it down. I love the title, Better to Win. Because I played sports for a long time. I'm a sports guy, so better to win. I definitely agree. It's always if you're keeping score, it's always better to win. As I noted, hardball lessons in leadership, influence, and the craft of politics. I had a bone to pick. I felt like there was one word left out. Uh, I always refer to the art and craft of politics because to me, we've always heard of politics being the art of the possible. And so I'm just curious, when you pick that title, there's a story I know behind that title. If you don't mind, share that title and then maybe some thoughts on the rest of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title came from a mentor of mine, and again, this is something that a lot of people don't talk about is when you make difficult decisions, and she had to make a difficult decision. She chose a side. She supported Dick Reardon for mayor of Los Angeles, and her name was Jadine Chin Nielsen. She had worked for U.S. Senator Cranston, and she had known Reardon from before, and he was running for mayor, but he was running for mayor against Mike Wu, an Asian American. So she got a lot of criticism from the Asian American community for supporting Dick Reardon. And it was very difficult. And she said, but in the end, because of loyalty and because of the decision, regardless of what happened, it's better to win. If you're going to get into a fight like this or make a difficult decision, pick a side, it's better to win because then when you won, you can do things to make up for it or to help bridge that gap that's out there. And I really thought that it was an important lesson that it's one thing for us to always talk about stuff and say what we're going to deliver, but it's really only when you win that you can actually deliver stuff or mend things or deal with the big issues that are at hand. But our society's gotten to the point where we just talk about it and then that's enough. And I think that part of the title was, look, if you're going to be in this world of doing public policy, you can believe everything you want. You can be sincere and very passionate about it. But if you don't win, you can't govern. And if you can't govern, you can't help people. And then also it was a little bit of a play on words because I also wanted to be about, look, Asian Americans have to be better if they want to win. We can't just keep doing what we do if we want to be in this space and not learn the skills necessary to win elections and have a seat at the table. So it was a little bit of a hidden meaning of we all need to be better, get better at this game in order to win. And then with regard to the art and craft of politics, well, this is where you get into the weird stuff about book advisors and cover advisors and your word limit and keywords. And I was advised on how to make myself a lot, like pick all the right words in the parameters that we had available. So it's funny, writing the book was a lot easier than navigating all of the aspects you need to understand or do in order to get a book published and for it to sell, semi-successfully.
Yeah, I'm laughing because any of my audience that has um, been around any length of time has heard us talk about this whole deal. But once you get into this part of it, yes, I completely understand. And I of course was only funning with you a little bit about the title, but I totally understand that part of it. Let's talk about the AAPI population here in California and the rise of Asian Americans. And for those who don't know, that's Asian American Pacific Islander. That population here in California in the political realm, because as we've seen before with other cultural groups, the Hispanic caucus, the Latino caucus, the Black caucus, others, it takes an effort. It's a lot of effort to go from where we were in representation in the state forever until just maybe the last 30 years, where we've seen a lot of various minority groups stepping up an effort to get a voice and get a seat at the table. You give a lot of good examples in this in this book about that effort. So tell me a little bit about that effort, because you were a big part of it to get that kind of representation and some of the stereotypes that had to be overcome along the way. So tell me a little bit about that effort.
Yeah, like anything else, democracy takes some work. And when I first got into politics, there were no Asian Americans that served in the legislature. That was 1988. And there wasn't an Asian that got elected to the legislature until 1992. So it was a significant number of years out there uh, where we didn't have any representation at all. And a lot of it is kind of structural because there weren't a lot of Asian Americans that ran for office. But also, it's more than that. And I think that for particularly the Asian American community and any ethnic community, it's not just about your demographics. And in some cases, demographics, even though they may have one connotation, for example, there was a time where we had significant populations, but not a lot of them were registered to vote. A lot of that changed when we went to automatic voter registration. And then there were a lot of Latinos that were registered to vote but didn't turn out. So there are a lot of different factors about representation that's out there. And you can't just assume that with the numbers that you're going to get representation. And then also with redistricting, how it's changed over time can have a significant impact upon whether or not your communities are split and whether or not you have enough population base in order to get elected. So getting representation in politics really is an active type of endeavor. You can't just hope that people will vote based upon what's fair or what's not fair. You have to run a campaign. You have to convince people to vote for you. You have to talk to voters. You have to communicate with voters. And I think that's also what makes politics robust is if you have those conversations. If it's automatic, then there's no accountability.
Right. And of course, in the last few years, we have seen so much hate and violence directed toward members of the Asian American community uh, around the country, but certainly here in California as well. I know lawmakers have been trying to address this because that's what lawmakers do. They want to pass a law, and I understand it, completely understand it. Um, what's your feeling on this, though? Is this something we can legislate our way out of, or is that maybe somewhere down the totem as far as where how we deal with this kind of societal problem?
I'm definitely an outlier in my generation because there used to be a saying that not every problem can be solved with legislation. And I don't think anybody believes that now. In fact, I think most people believe the only way to solve a problem is with legislation. However, considering all of our unsolved problems, it's pretty clear that that is a myth. So I think that there are a lot of things that can be done in order to address some of the problems we have, but not necessarily legislating. I think just having people at the table and being visible is very helpful in providing that type of diversity and that type of perspective that everybody belongs in society, not necessarily that they can legislate somebody's actions. But there are some things that they can do that are helpful. For example, the API caucus passed 167 million budget augmentation in order to fund efforts to address bullying, address hate crimes, provide more structural support. But certainly that's not going to be the one-off solution to all of this stuff that's here. It's about having an active society that is talking about and developing a social perspective that supports inclusion, supports a diversity of views in a constructive manner, and a civil society. And that, again, goes back to the character of the leaders that are there to take responsibility over their constituencies and say, hey, we're not going to speak about people of color in this way. It's okay for you to agree on policies on economics or other types of things, but there are certain ways that we're going to have these conversations and certain ways that we're not going to have these conversations.
One of the things that comes across a lot in your book, it frustrates me to no end as someone who's also a little bit of a student of history. I go back every now and then. I will watch, go on YouTube and watch a news clip of some event from the 60s or 70s and see how the news presents it. And it's so much more direct and to the point and almost staid, which is fine because that's how I want the news. And then you watch it now and it's such hyperbole and everything is so grandiose and there's emphasis on elocution of certain words. And as in the title, once the consultants get involved, my God, they want to go, everything is based on Google search words and all. Oh, it just drives you insane, right? But it seems that that's where we're also at with political discourse. And it seems like now when you have a politician who speaks plainly, it stands out because it's so rare now, because they all speak in such homilies and these bromides and things and cliches, and they don't answer any question. They talk all around it. And then now we have a governor who won't even talk to us, right? Unless it's, over Zoom where he doesn't have to actually see any of us. And it's really frustrating to me, both as a political reporter and as a consumer and as a voter, to have this loss of just plain spoken language. And so, I've certainly sensed that that's a lot of your frustration too, and why you decided it was time to hang it up is that we're really at a point where we've lost a lot of that plain spokenness, even in the back rooms, which correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm long bloated lead into this question, but was it as bad behind the scenes, I guess, as what we see in front, in front of the scenes?
What you see in front of the screen is comedic. What you see behind the scenes is soul crushing, because to see I would say, acrobatics that are involved in justifying the decisions we make would just be terrifying to the public. And I sat into too many meetings where what was being proposed made no sense whatsoever to me. But somehow, in the course of the conversation, everybody else in the room had convinced themselves that that was the best course of action. And I got to the point where I thought I was the crazy person. So that helped elicit my retirement, because I couldn't differentiate between, my sanity and the sanity of the others in the room, because what they were talking about really didn't make any sense to me from just a problem-solving perspective. It oftentimes decisions were made because of one factor, which was not to solve the problem, but then they verbally wrapped it around so many times in order to make it seem like it solved the problem, but it never did.
Well, what it sounds like you're saying is a lot of political cover.
Right.
Well, which leads to the question, here, of course, in California, we have a very strong Democratic supermajority. There are other states where it's exactly the opposite. It's very strong Republican majorities, supermajorities. Even in some states where the governor might be a Democrat, I think in North Carolina comes to mind. And I'm sure there are others I have to think about a little bit more, but ultimately, that always feels to me like you end up with a lot of groupthink in those situations. And even if you agree with the general platform of whatever party's in power, it does seem to me like what ends up happening is like anyone who stands up and says, hey, maybe we should do something different, they're at risk of getting ostracized. And it feels like parties end up eating their own a lot. And again, this is both sides. I have seen it on both sides. And I'm curious, again, how does that parlay out to policy? How does that parlay out to what ends up getting voted into law?
Usually results in bad policy, and it's particularly pronounced. These inequities are particularly pronounced when you have a situation like in California where term limits has eviscerated institutional knowledge. So the people who know better, or the people who have seen where groupthink has left things in a bad shape, aren't here to say, yeah, we've seen this movie before and we can't do that, and this is why. Those voices have diminished as a result of term limits eviscerating both the experience of the legislators and the experience of the staff. So nobody really has the foundation to say, oh, yeah, this is a bad idea. For example, we're going into the first time in many, many years, probably a decade or so, of budget deficits. And the legislators that currently serve here, except for the ones that may have been staff at the time, had never experienced a budget deficit. And there's probably a majority of staffers that have never experienced a budget deficit. So they have absolutely no impact or no idea what the impact is. When we had budget deficits in the past, we had hundreds, if not thousands, of people come to the Capitol to, in wheelchairs, in, all sorts of, horrible conditions, pleading with us to not cut their programs. And it was heart-wrenching. And a lot of staffers that are currently here have never seen that before in their lives, in their careers.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how all this gets handled. Now, some of you might be wondering, how does this all apply to writing? Well, it does because, first of all, as I noted, you have to decide what it is you're going to put into this book. You got to decide what you're going to leave out. As always, the challenge when anyone writes a biography, even one that's only partial biography here. What's been the feedback that you have got on this from former colleagues, people you know? Were there people that were appreciative of being included, people that wish you'd left them out, people that were pissed off at you that you didn't put them in? What's been the general feedback
The general feedback's been very positive, and I try to be very positive in the story. So it's not a tell-all, but it does give you a playbook, and I think that that's where everybody really felt the most appreciation, that this is a little bit of Aesop's tales for politics, so they could see the parallels between what they do today and how they can conduct themselves. It was written more as a workbook, or at least a playbook for how you do this job, but told in the way of stories, as opposed to some more clinical way of describing it. Because that's how I learned. I learned from stories, and I thought it would be entertaining to write stories. And there were a couple places where I had to like change names and change situations in order to protect the guilty. But I think that that's the best way to really convey all the emotional range of the experience for people who are interested in this particular area.
Yeah. And, I really appreciated, again, the fact that that's everything that you were talking about, whether it was leadership or character or influence, how to effectively influence people, was really told with real world examples. And again, it doesn't really matter what party you're. Now, of course, we know you're a Democrat, but I think somebody from the other side of the aisle could really learn a lot from this as well. And I think there's lessons here that I think even maybe would apply to things outside of politics. And the thing that comes to mind, there's a part in the book, and I love this, early on where you talk about how you got good at politics, and this is a quote, because you were volunteering for, quote, every shit job I could get in a campaign, unquote. And I feel like the lesson there that applies to authors is, you have to do the work. You have to do all of the dirty work and go through rejection and failure. And you have to get smacked down sometimes, and you have to keep crawling up off the ground and starting over again if need be, or finding another way, because there's a lot of rejection in this business, and there's a lot of failure in politics too. And so I thought that was a really interesting lesson. What other things maybe from your career did you apply to the process of writing this book?
I think that somebody asked me about those experiences, and I said if I didn't have these experiences, it would be a very boring book. I mean, nobody wants to read a book or watch a movie where the hero just go through life and everything is great and everything's a victory. Everybody loves a comeback. Everybody loves to experience that journey, and you have to add all of those aspects of it that make your journey interesting. And if it was perfect, it really wouldn't be interesting. I think that, in the world of politics, when we're trying to explain stuff, we also have to explain it in terms of that journey, explain it in terms of characters and experiences that people can relate to. And I think that that makes you a better writer, and it makes you a better politician and political operative, is if you can really encapsulate and understand where people are coming from and reflect that in your writing.
Right. Well, I only have one more serious question for you, and I think this is also one that could be applied to a lot of things. Now, again, you had a lot of experiences, some good, some bad. When you left, it feels like, it had really turned toward the negative. How do you take that and also observe what we are seeing now, and not be cynical about everything? I mean, especially when you look around the country and you see some things going on around the country, and kind of the mainstreaming of racism again, and sexism, and anti homophobia, and just some of the things you see, and you go, gosh, you and I are probably similar in age. You think, we were the generation, we were supposed to have defeated all that, and look, here it is, and it seems stronger than, I mean, there are actual real Nazis that are still out there. You're like, did you never see a movie? The Nazis are the bad guys. How is it that I mean, you see it and you think, how is this even possible? How do you avoid being cynical at the end of the day with all of this?
That's a great question, and it's actually, I gave it a lot of thought as I was writing this. And there's a quote from it was either Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, that you can only see the stars when it's dark. So yeah, there's a lot of dark out there. But if you look at the bright spot, if you focus on the bright spots, and we can all be part of that bright spot that's out there, that gives somebody just a glimmer of hope. You don't have to light up the whole sky. You just have to be the light at the end of the tunnel, so that there's something to hang on to. And that was my hope in this writing this book, is like, yeah, you can still fix a couple of things. Things are dire, things aren't, guaranteed, but if you keep at it, you'll get there. Just like writing a book. If you keep at it, you'll get there.
Yeah. Just don't quit. Quitting's the only real failure, right? That's how we're
Right.
going. Well, I always like to end on a fun question, and I didn't have to think all that hard on yours, because it should be obvious. So I always ask people, I can put you together with one of the following three people for whatever you want: dinner, drinks, campaign talk, whatever. Which of these three would you choose, and why? And the options I'll give you are JFK, John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, or the father of our country, also former slave owner, George Washington. You could sit down with any one of those three for a long conversation, pick their brain. Who would you choose and why?
I would say Franklin Roosevelt because of the adversity he overcame while he was president and how much effort that must have been with the weight on his shoulders at the time. Obviously he had a debilitating disease. He was in the middle of a war. In fact, I read this book by a guy named David Kwong, who is a magician and also does a crossword puzzle for the New York Times. He wrote this book called Spellbound, and it's about magic and how you can use the principles of magic in order to achieve great things. And he used the example of Franklin Roosevelt, how they use magic, kind of stagecraft, in order to make him look healthier and help him uh, fulfill the vision of a president that helped him carry the country through its difficult times. So I think it would just be really interesting to see, how somebody like that, faced all these different types of things. And he definitely seemed to have like a personality where he was very level-headed despite all the craziness that was going on.
Right. Well, good choice. I like that. Bill Wong, it's been fabulous speaking with you again. Again, I really enjoyed the book. For those who may have missed it, it's called Better to Win, and it definitely is better to win. And I really appreciate you sharing all the insights into your experiences and to where we're at with our politics, and also what it took to put this book together. It's really great. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And I promised you I was going to come back with a sales pitch. I am. You can hit subscribe on whatever favorite podcatcher you're using. You can do it on the YouTube channel. You can leave me a nice review. I would appreciate it because that does help other people find the show. And hey, why not do somebody a solid, help them find the kind of content that I do provide here. It's totally free. I don't make any money doing this. I do this because I love talking to smart people. Not that hard to find people smarter than me. And that makes it really easy for me to have a chat. So, hey, hopefully it helps you too. And along those lines, I'm going to say one last thing. It's the same thing I leave you with every time. Tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. For my guest, Bill Wong, for myself, Rich Eisen, for my two dogs asleep behind me, this has been the Open Mic. We'll see you next time.